You look in the mirror and you see an expert, a strategist. But universe has a wicked, borderline sadistic sense of humor. No international treaty prepared me for the quiet friction of that cabinet. Oh, this is a wonderful test. You should practice radical forgiveness. I felt deeply angry and frustrated. You shouldn't feel this way. Why are you so petty? Be spiritual. Please spare me. This is where pop spirituality flies straight into outer space. We've been systematically trained to abuse ourselves under the guise of holiness. It's a cheap illusion. This ridiculous corridor feud was actually a brutal lesson in unconditional love. Physics and biology are now tracking the exact same mechanics, and because reality is a fractal on a global scale, the war of Russia against Ukraine is exactly that. And when you look past the rigid cultural dogmas of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, you find the exact same universal blueprint. There was a time when I helped shape national legislation and shifted gears at the international level, dealing with foreign states and high-profile organizations. You would think that after that kind of experience, a person develops a certain, let's call it, existential weight. You look in the mirror and you see an expert, a strategist, someone who operates on the causal plane, juggling massive structures of human reality. But universe has a wicked, borderline sadistic sense of humor, because absolutely nothing, not a single geopolitical task, not a single macroscopic strategy, required as much brutal, terrifying inner labor as forcing myself to deal with my neighbor who decided to park her ugly, oversized wooden cabinet right in the middle of our shared hallway. Nothing, no international treaty prepared me for the quiet friction of that cabinet. At first I tried to ignore it. I told myself it didn't matter, but it kept gnawing me every single day. I felt deeply angry and frustrated. Angry because my personal space was being casually violated. Legally speaking, the hallway is shared property. It belongs to me exactly as much as it belongs to my neighbor. And when she claimed it, she didn't just move her furniture. She literally walked into my life space and occupied a part of it without my permission. But worse, I was completely frustrated with myself for being angry. I kept thinking, I'm supposed to be advanced. I have all this knowledge, all this spiritual and systemic experience. Why on earth am I letting a stupid wooden box break my inner peace? When avoiding it failed, I tried talking to her. She ignored me with the kind of majestic indifference usually reserved for royalty. Then I wrote to the building management. Silence. I tried meeting them. More silence. Finally, I had to escalate this to the city authorities. I filed official reports, chased down bureaucrats. Basically, I deployed the entire arsenal of my systemic, international level expertise to remove a storage box from a corridor. Now, if you ask a mainstream spiritual influencer about this, they will probably tell you something like, oh, this is a wonderful test. You should practice radical forgiveness. Breathe into your heart space, send light to your neighbor, and realize that the cabinet doesn't exist. It's all an illusion. To that, I say, please spare me, because this is exactly where the trap snaps shut. This is where pop spirituality flies straight into outer space, leaving reality completely behind. A high-level cosmic truth that everything is ultimately an illusion is used as a cheap psychological painkiller. It's the ultimate form of spiritual bypassing, using abstract concepts to escape the raw, uncomfortable facts of your physical existence. And we've weaponized this. We've been conditioned to believe that transcending means pretending we don't feel the violation, numbness, or rage. Most people will look at a story like this and see a petty, mundane, neighborly feud. They look at it and think, why is she making such a big deal out of a hallway? But this wasn't about a cabinet in a hallway, and it definitely wasn't a spiritual lesson designed to make me more patient. Believe me, after the last 7 years of navigating systemic crisis, I have a literal black belt in patience. I could practically lecture Buddhist monks on the subject. My patience wasn't the problem. This situation tested how much space I actually allow myself to occupy. And here is the absolute peak of the joke. I could easily occupy space on a global scale, but standing up for my right to an empty 3 feet of concrete outside my own apartment door felt like jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. My system was screaming. And this brings us to uncomfortable questions. Why on earth did we decide that awakening means turning yourself into a spiritual doormat for other people? Who convinced us that to forgive means to leave everything exactly as it is? Who said that awareness or spirituality equals absolute inaction? What is the internal script running in your head right now? But what about turning the other cheek? What about Jesus letting himself be crucified on the cross? Let me ask you, are we absolutely sure we understand his message? Do we truly believe that the crucifixion was an act of helpless, spineless submission to other people? Or was it something else entirely? Do we truly believe that turning the other cheek is a command to be a passive, defenseless doormat? Or was it a display of such immense, unshakable internal power that no outside aggression could ever touch it? The paradox we are going to unpack today is that this ridiculous corridor feud was actually a brutal, flawless lesson in unconditional love. And it has nothing to do with loving your neighbor. Not because it taught me to accept her garbage, but because it forced me to finally stop fighting my own. So today we're going to use this exact cabinet to dismantle one of the most toxic, suffocating illusions in the entire spiritual marketplace. We're going to break down the myth of unconditional love. And as we are about to see, it doesn't start with holy prayers, and it definitely doesn't start with trying to force yourself to love your neighbor or forgiving their interior design choices. It starts somewhere else entirely. Let's dive in. We've been conditioned into thinking that unconditional love is either a sacrificial martyrdom from religion or a heavy emotional high from pop culture. The first option is the saint in an ancient painting who smiles while being burned at the stake, or the mother who completely obliterates her own identity, interests, and sanity, claiming she lives only for her child. A toxic pattern we dissected back in season 1. In this narrative, you are expected to suffer and meekly let people walk all over you. We've been fed this for centuries by religious dogma, conditioned to believe that love equals perpetual self-sacrifice. The second option is the tragic hero in a Hollywood melodrama weeping in the rain, or the textbook enabler who tolerates toxic betrayals and calls it fighting for love. This is where we confuse love with a dopamine rush, with the frantic urge to fix another human being, or with a desperate hunger for validation. We take our psychological codependency, wrap it in a shiny spiritual bow, and call it unconditional love. It's a cheap illusion designed to temporarily fill an inner void. But that's an unhealed psyche, not love. It's the ego interpreter, that hard-coded software we talked about in the previous episodes, that subverts this concept to keep its control intact. Let's look at the mechanics of this illusion, and to understand it, we need to look at the phenomenon that I like to call the twin illusions of the ego: inflated ego and deficient ego. But first, let's remember what we established in the previous episodes. The ego is not an entity. It's not a little demon sitting inside your brain. The ego is simply a tight, tangled bundle of thoughts, programs, and survival mechanisms that got stuck in your mental and emotional field due to past trauma. They act as distorted lenses through which you now view reality. So when we say inflated ego or deficient ego, we are not talking about the size of some energy field around you. We are talking about different sets of mental programs, unconscious frameworks, that create two opposite ways these lenses distort your vision. So, when we hear the word ego, we usually picture a very specific villain, an aggressive, loud, self-centered person who steamrolls everyone to get what they want. This is the inflated ego. In its extreme form, it's pure narcissism. This term was originally introduced by Carl Jung, who used the concept of psychic inflation to describe this exact state, where the ego blows up like a balloon, loses touch with reality, and fancies itself supreme. But this is only half of the story. There is a second, far more dangerous mutation that nobody talks about because it wears the mask of virtue. While psychology has long recognized the concept of the inflated ego, we rarely examine its shadow twin. I like to call it deficient ego. Jung himself didn't use this exact term, but he was deeply familiar with the phenomenon. He described it as negative inflation, a state where the ego, instead of feeling all-powerful, drops into an abyss of insignificance, taking on the guilt of the world and quietly fetishizing its own suffering. It's the I am the smallest, most broken, most wretched creature script. Jung warned that when a weak ego is swallowed by its own shadow, or when it completely identifies with the persona of a martyr, a mask of holy submission permanently glues itself to the face, just to hide a terrifying fear of real life and conflict. Later psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut formalized this duality as two sides of the exact same developmental trauma. He called the inflated side the grandiose self, and its mirror image, which perfectly maps onto what we just called deficient ego, he identified as the depleted, weakened self. A system that feels so empty and small that it constantly seeks an idealized figure to latch onto. Someone else's rules to follow, someone else's boundaries to serve, just to feel permitted to exist. When you strip away the psychological terminology, it comes down to two opposite lenses through which we view reality. The lens of the inflated ego says, I am only safe if I dominate. The lens of the deficient ego says, I am only safe if I disappear. I am only good if I allow myself to be consumed. And because the deficient ego desperately needs to hide this deep sense of unworthiness, it deploys two masterfully crafted survival scripts. The first one is what we call the savior complex. The ego loves a good project, and there is no project more intoxicating for the ego than trying to save or fix someone else. We look at a broken, toxic, or completely indifferent partner, or a neighbor who steps all over our space, and we tell ourselves, if I just love them enough, if I am patient enough, if I tolerate their chaos unconditionally, they will change. This is not love. This is a subtle, arrogant manipulation. It is the deficient ego's hidden desire to be a savior, to feel superior, and to avoid looking into its own terrifying emptiness. You aren't accepting them as they are. You are gambling on their potential future version to validate your effort. But if the savior complex doesn't work, the deficient ego quickly pivots to a much more sophisticated illusion, the flawless spiritual facet. In spiritual circles, unconditional love is treated like the final level of a video game. You meditate enough, you clear your chakras, and suddenly you become this elevated, sterile being who feels absolutely no negative emotions. You become pure light. And so, when reality hits you, when someone violates your boundaries, for instance, when life drops a heavy wooden cabinet in your path, your system naturally reacts with anger. But your deficient ego immediately flags it. Error. Anger is low vibrational. Good spiritual people don't get angry. You must bypass this. You must transcend. And what happens? You force yourself into a state of holy compliance. You suppress the raw, honest signal of your biology. You pretend to love your enemy while silently choking on your own suppressed resentment. Now let's bring it all back to the hallway outside my apartment. When my neighbor parked her giant cabinet in the shared corridor, it was a classic unconscious move of an inflated ego. Her lens didn't see a shared space, it simply saw a vacuum to be filled for her own comfort. But what was my system's first reaction? My hard-coded software immediately tried to deploy the deficient ego script. It desperately tried to wrap my fear of conflict in a beautiful, fluffy spiritual blanket. It whispered, "Don't descend to her level. Be the bigger person. Turn the other cheek. Just let her have the space." But let's be real. Turning the other cheek to a wooden cabinet isn't spirituality. It's spiritual bypassing. It's the deficient ego trying to feel holy while actively participating in its own self-betrayal. And here lies the core realization. Every single one of these cultural and spiritual myths turn unconditional love into an outward movement. It is always about how you should treat someone else. It's an endless, exhausting checklist of how to perform love so that the world, or God, or your partner will finally see how good you are. But you cannot give water from an empty, poisoned well. And this is the key to understanding why, when it comes to the ego, either inflated or deficient, it is never about love. You see, by its very definition, the ego is a system of deficit. It is fundamentally empty, and it is hard-coded to fill its inner voids by using other people. Whether it does that through open manipulation, high-vibrational spiritual bypassing, or playing the holy martyr. Real love doesn't use anyone to patch up its own holes. Real love is entirely self-contained. It doesn't demand validation or perform checklists. It simply shares from a place of inner abundance. And this abundance is born only when you learn how to give yourself everything you desperately seek from the outside world. When you finally learn how to meet your own emotional needs by yourself. This is the master key. Unconditional love does not begin with what you perform for others. It begins with what you finally grant to yourself. But to grant this to yourself, you first have to dismantle the most elaborate illusion that the spiritual ego has ever built. You have to look at how we've been systematically trained to abuse ourselves under the guise of holiness. And here is your first red pill new. Unconditional love does not start with holy prayers, and it definitely doesn't start with trying to force yourself to love your neighbor. It starts when you finally, mercifully leave yourself alone. Most people live in a state of continuous brutal inner warfare. You criticize your every move, suppress emotions you deem inappropriate, and force your body and mind to conform to standards that have absolutely nothing to do with your unique nature. We treat ourselves like merciless prison wardens, constantly policing our own raw experience. Think about what happens inside you when someone steps over your boundaries, like my neighbor with her cabinet. Your body creates a physical reaction, anger, distress, a knot in your stomach. This is the intelligence of your biology, screaming, something is wrong here. But what does your internal prison warden do? It immediately attacks that reaction. If you are run by the deficient ego software, you tell yourself, you shouldn't feel this way. Why are you so petty? Just ignore it. Be spiritual. You literally refuse to be present for your own pain because you are obsessed with fixing your life, improving your feelings, and dragging yourself towards some artificial, sterile ideal of a perfect human being. But if you are constantly fighting what you feel, you aren't present. You are just locked in an endless, exhausting civil war. Unconditional love is the exact moment you allow yourself to feel anger, pain, fear, or total exhaustion, and you don't immediately rush to fix it. It is the rare, quiet, almost sacred capacity to simply sit with your own experience exactly as it is, without passing judgment. It's when you stand in that hallway looking at that annoying cabinet and you say to yourself, Yes, I am furious right now. Yes, I feel violated. And I am not going to spiritualize this away. I'm going to let this feeling exist completely. The second you learn to sit with your own experience without judgment, love stops being a lofty spiritual concept. As we discussed in Season 1, it ceases to be an outward movement of deficiency. It becomes your natural default state. It is essentially presence. And here is the ultimate paradox of reality. When you stop fighting your inner experience, you finally get the clarity to change your outer experience. When I finally left myself alone, when I stopped blaming myself for being angry about a stupid piece of furniture, the internal noise stopped. The deficient ego left the building. Anger is always a biological signal that your boundaries have been breached. But because I didn't suppress this anger, and because my ego was no longer seeking validation or fighting for its life, I didn't descend into a low vibrational petty shouting match at my neighbor's door. Instead, from that point of absolute internal integration, clear systematic action was born. I took my macro level experience, picked up the phone and went straight to the city authorities. The exact structure designed to enforce the rules of shared living, step by step, calmly, relentlessly. I didn't do it to punish my neighbor. I did it because I love myself enough to refuse to live in a compromised space. I did it because I realized that my daily comfort, my peace, and my right to my own 3 feet of concrete mattered just as much as any global legislation I have ever touched. The cabinet appeared in the hallway, and I accepted it as a raw fact of my current reality, just as I accepted the anger that naturally flowed from it. I didn't engage in mental gymnastics trying to intellectualize why this experience was happening to me. I simply lived it in the absolute present moment, exactly as it felt, using the highest level of awareness available to me. This is the ultimate definition of presence. And this is what real love actually is. Because love is presence, and it never starts with your neighbor, it starts with you. And once you grasp that love is pure presence, you unlock a terrifyingly beautiful truth that bridges thousands of years of human evolution. This internal state of yours is not just a psychological trick. It is the exact same law that governs the entire fabric of existence. This is not a new thought, not some shallow, comforting New Age concept wrapped in trendy mindfulness terminology. What we're talking about here is the core hidden architecture of reality that every mature mystical tradition has been trying to point to for centuries, and which is now gradually starting to be confirmed by modern science. But before we dive into the different traditions, we need to clarify 2 specific words that have been deeply corrupted by modern pop culture: mystic and esoteric. Let's strip away the New Age nonsense once and for all. First, a mystic is not someone who sees spirits or lives in a cave. A mystic is simply a practitioner who demands the direct, raw experience of reality, of the source, rather than settling for second-hand religious dogmas. The ancient mystics were in essence the scientists of the spirit. Second, esoteric does not mean magic or crystals. It comes from the ancient contrast with exoteric. Exoteric knowledge is outward-facing. It's the public surface layer of religion, the rituals, codes, and texts you analyze from the outside. Esoteric knowledge, however, is entirely inward-facing. It is knowledge acquired exclusively by diving into your own interiority. It is the study of reality from the inside out. Now, for the purpose of this episode, we are looking at the core esoteric branches of the 3 major Abrahamic religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. These are the insights of the mystics who operated at the very heart of these traditions, yet whose direct experience almost always ran counter to the rigid official dogmas of their respective religions. And this is exactly the point. Religious institutions demanded blind obedience to texts and intellectual concepts, but the mystics bypassed the middleman. They weren't interested in second-hand theories about God. They demanded a direct, raw, and practical experience of the source. And when you look past the rigid cultural dogmas of these Abrahamic religions and look at the actual discoveries of their deepest practitioners, you find the exact same universal blueprint. Divine presence is nothing more than absolute, unwarped presence to what is. In Sufism, the mystical heart of Islam, the ultimate state of love is called fana, the complete dissolution of the ego-centered stance. Love appears only when the internal war stops. The great Sufi poet Rumi wrote, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." The cabinet in the hallway wasn't the barrier. My internal prison warden trying to police my anger, that was the barrier. Leaving myself alone was the dissolution of that barrier. In Kabbalah, the mystical dimension of Judaism, there is a profound concept called tzimtzum, divine contraction. It says that in order for the world to exist, God had to clear a space, to step back and allow existence to just be. Think about the paradox. The ultimate act of divine love was not occupying and dominating everything, but creating a clearing. When you practice presence with your own pain or rage without rushing to fix it, you are practicing tzimtzum. You are clearing a space within your own consciousness for reality to exist exactly as it is. And in Christian mysticism, Meister Eckhart spoke of Gelassenheit, a state of ultimate let-up, of utter letting things be. He argued that you don't find the divine by adding spiritual practices or performing holiness. You find it when you become completely empty of your ego's demands, expectations, and mental gymnastics. It is the radical act of leaving yourself alone so that reality can finally breathe through you. Physics and biology are now tracking the exact same mechanics of presence. In quantum mechanics, there is a famous principle known as the observer effect. A particle exists as a wave of infinite possibilities until it interacts with a measurement apparatus, collapsing into a single fixed coordinate. In your psychology, your ego interpreter acts as that rigid measurement apparatus. When you refuse to look at your raw experience, when you fight your anger or try to spiritualize it away, you're actually freeze-framing it. Your mental commentary collapses the fluid passing current of life into a solid heavy object. I am an angry person, she is my enemy, this corridor is a battlefield. You trap the energy, forcing it to crystallize into a rigid, painful structure that haunts your subconscious. But what happens when you deploy radical presence? You don't look at your rage from the outside as an isolated observer. Instead, you realize that the observer and the observed are one. You stop trying to measure, define, or fix the emotion. And the moment the ego interpreter stops its measurement, the illusion of a solid, separate problem dissolves. The crystallized anger melts back into its natural state, a fluid wave of energy moving through the infinite ocean of your awareness. You don't destroy the wave, you simply stop forcing it to freeze. Modern neurobiology captures this beautifully through the mechanics of the amygdala, the brain's ancient almond-shaped alarm system responsible for detecting threats and processing survival emotions. When your boundaries are violated, like when someone hijacks your shared corridor, your amygdala triggers a primal fight or flight response. Cortisol and adrenaline flood your system. Now, if your deficient ego software steps in and starts judging you, whispering you shouldn't be angry, be spiritual, be above this, you trigger a secondary stress loop. You are now stressed about being stressed. You lock yourself in a brutal, exhausting neurochemical civil war. But what happens when you practice unconditional love as presence? The moment you consciously notice your anger and say, yes, I am furious and I allow this feeling to be, your prefrontal cortex kicks in. In our physical biology, the brain acts as a receiver, translating the non-local signal of consciousness into physical movement and chemical reality. And the prefrontal cortex is the specific part of this receiver that acts as the dial, tuning your nervous system out of survival mode and back into the frequency of pure awareness. In neurobiology, this act of tuning is described as name it to tame it. By simply being present with the biological sensation without trying to fix it, you align the receiver of your body with the clear, unwarped signal of your consciousness. You signal down to your nervous system that you are safe. The amygdala cools down, the chemical fire is put out, and the internal noise stops. And this is where the ancient world and modern science discover that they are looking through the exact same eye. Whether you look through the lens of a 13th century Sufi text or a 21st century brain scan, the law is identical. Love is not an outward performance, it is steady presence. It is how consciousness rests in reality when it no longer needs to hold, prove, or control in order to feel whole. In the first season of this podcast, we had a major episode about how we constantly confuse love with attachment. Back then, we defined love not as an emotional high, but as a consequence of ending the inner war. And now, when we look at it through the lens of everything we've discussed today, we can finally stop thinking that unconditional love is about being nice or being a saint or tolerating people's garbage until our boundaries melt into a puddle of holy compliance. Real unconditional love is something else entirely. It isn't an emotional high, it isn't a dopamine rush, it's the exact moment you allow yourself to feel anger, pain, violation, or total exhaustion, and you don't immediately rush to fix it. You don't try to polish it with spiritual concepts. You simply sit with your own raw, uncomfortable experience exactly as it is. It is, pure and simple, the ability to be radically present for your own experience. And now look at how beautifully this circle closes. When you stop fighting your biology, when you stop forcing yourself to conform to the spiritualized scripts of the ego, the inner warfare ends. You are no longer trying to extract validation from your neighbor, and you are no longer punishing yourself for being human. And when you feel whole inside your own skin, you finally get the clarity to act flawlessly in the outside world. This is the exact point where the ultimate shift happens, because only when you master the capacity to be present for your own raw experience do you finally gain the ability to give that presence to others. You become capable of being present for their experience without trying to manipulate it, without trying to fix it, without projecting your expectations, and without passing judgment. When someone next to you is drowning in anger, grief, or confusion, you no longer run to save them out of your own deficiency. You don't try to polish their reality just to make yourself feel comfortable. Instead, you simply sit with them. You become a steady, immovable space where they are allowed to breathe, struggle, and exist exactly as they are. And this, and only here, never a second earlier, is where you finally truly learn how to love your neighbor. Not because a dogma commanded you to, but because your inner own abundance left you with no other choice. But let's be entirely honest about what loving your neighbor actually means. It means accepting them exactly as they are. It means allowing them to exist without forcing your corrections onto them. But it does not mean tolerating the garbage inside your living space. I do not trespass on my neighbor's right to be ignorant. If she chooses to live in chaos, it is not up to me to teach her how to live. She can remain ignorant within her own life space for as long as she wants. But that does not mean she can bring her chaos into my life. And because reality is a fractal, on a global scale, the war of Russia against Ukraine is exactly that. It is the very same dynamic. And I say this not as an outside observer, but as a survivor of this very war. When you look through this lens, you begin to understand the terrifying scale to which everything in this world is governed by the exact same laws, and to what extent modern global society is built entirely on ego deficits. Because the external world is always a mirror. External wars are started only by those who live in a state of permanent inner warfare. They attack because they cannot sit with their own internal void. They invade because their own ego is fractured. Conversely, those who possess the courage to end the inner war, those who can look their own pain and chaos in the eye and remain still, are the only ones capable of putting an end to external wars. They do it not by compliance, but by becoming an unshakable wall against which someone else's delusion shutters. This is what the mystical traditions call divine presence. It is not an abstract cloud in the sky. It is you, mature, integrated, and still, acting as a clear mirror for the living universe. So here we are now. We started today with a giant, ugly wooden cabinet blocking a shared apartment hallway, a petty, mundane, almost ridiculous situation that most spiritual teachings would tell you to either transcend or bypass with a fake forced smile of radical forgiveness. But as we pulled back the layers, we discovered that this cabinet wasn't a distraction from your spiritual path. It was the path. True unconditional love is not a lifetime movie script. It's not an ancient religious painting of silent, miserable martyrdom. And it definitely isn't a high vibrational space where you become so enlightened that nothing ever bothers you. Real love is presence. And it starts with a fierce, uncompromising maturity of consciousness that refuses to betray itself. It's the radical act of finally, mercifully leaving yourself alone. So the next time your boundaries are pushed, whether it's a toxic partner, a demanding boss, or just a neighbor hijacking your 3 feet of concrete outside your door, remember the two lenses of the ego. Notice if your system tries to deploy the loud, aggressive software of the inflated ego. But more importantly, watch out for that sneaky silent prison warden of the deficient ego, trying to wrap your self-abandonment in a beautiful, holy blanket of spiritual compliance. Don't buy into the illusion. Take the red pill of the everyday. Allow yourself to feel exactly what you feel. Sit with your anger, sit with your discomfort, name it and let it breathe. Stop forcing your fluid living reality to freeze into a rigid, painful problem. Because the moment you stop fighting the war inside your own skin, the chemical fire dies down, the internal noise stops. Your receiver aligns with the clear signal of pure awareness, and from that place of absolute internal integration, you don't just react, you act relentlessly, systematically, flawlessly. You cannot occupy space on a macroscopic scale if you keep forcing yourself to shrink at your own front door. So leave yourself alone, claim your space, and clean out your corridor, both inside and out. Until next time, Keep resting in reality.